On September 1st, 1939, World War II erupted in Europe after Germany invaded Poland and the United Kingdom and France retaliated by declaring war. Over the course of 6 years, Europe watched as German forces expanded their territory both east and west before the Allied forces turned the tide and slowly forced Germany to retreat. As the war progressed, tens of thousands of men from both sides were captured by the enemy and sent to prisoners of war camps throughout Europe. Allied soldiers taken prisoner found themselves incarcerated in these camps across Germany and broader German-controlled territory, especially Poland. It was in a camp named Stalag Luft III, located near Sagan in modern-day Poland, where an incredibly dangerous and daring escape plan was hatched by a group of Allied prisoners of war. Although the main escape attempt would draw on the efforts of hundreds of Allied soldiers from all corners of the globe, the origin of the Great Escape can be traced to the courage, tenacity and intellect of 3 men. Wing Commander Harry Wings Day, Squadron Leader Roger Bushell, and Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Buckley. It would become one of the greatest escape stories ever told. Wing Commander Harry Wings Day was born into a military family in Borneo in 1898. He had been sent to England to be educated at Haileybury College near Hertford, where he joined the Officers' Cadet Corps. In 1916, with the First World War underway, Harry Day joined the British Royal Marines and was commissioned as a second lieutenant before being deployed as part of a Marine detachment aboard the battleship HMS Britannia. 2 days before the First World War ended, the HMS Britannia was torpedoed and sunk. During the chaos, Harry braved the smoke and flames to return below deck and rescue 2 injured men. For this act of bravery, he was subsequently awarded the Albert Medal. After the end of the war, Harry was promoted to lieutenant and commanded several Marine detachments aboard British Navy ships. In 1924, he joined the Fleet Air Arm as a naval officer before joining the 23 RAF Squadron, where he was eventually promoted to Squadron Leader in 1936. After the outbreak of World War II, Harry was promised a staff job at RAF Bomber Headquarters, given his age and experience. However, he requested active duty with an operational squadron, and in 1939, at the age of 41, he was placed in command of 57 Squadron. On October 13, 1939, barely a month since the outbreak of war, Harry led his squadron on a photo reconnaissance mission over Ham-Hanover-Soest, an important rail line in northern Germany. Harry's plane was shot down, and despite suffering burns to his hands and face, he managed to safely parachute to the ground, where he was subsequently captured by German forces. After spending a few days being treated for his burns at a German army hospital, he was transferred several times between different camps before eventually being settled at a small camp near Oberursel, known as Stalag Luft. Stalag Luft was short for Durchgangslager der Luftwaffe, or Transit Camp of the Luftwaffe. Almost all Allied airmen who were shot down spent some time at Stalag Luft before they were transferred to more permanent prison camps. Harry was a tall man with green eyes set under a deep brow, and his appearance commanded an air of admiration from both his fellow Allied POWs as well as their German captors. Harry was a senior officer and older than the other prisoners, and became something of an inspirational figure for the younger POWs, most of whom were sullen figures following their capture by the Germans. The Germans were fond of greeting newly captured Allied soldiers with the words, "For you, the war is over," and morale among the men was often low. Drawing on his own experiences from fighting during the First World War, Harry Day would say to the dispirited men, "1918 may seem a long way off to some of you. At the beginning of that year, it looked as though we had lost the war. It may seem to some of you now that you have already lost this one. But we beat the Germans in 1918, and what you have already done will help to beat them again. For you, the war is not over." Roger Bushell was a South African-born British aviator and squadron leader. His father was a mining engineer who had emigrated to South Africa and had used his accumulated wealth to see that Roger was educated in Britain, first at Wellington College in Berkshire, before studying law at Pembroke College in Cambridge. Roger was described by his mother as both courageous and a natural leader. Roger excelled at sports and was an accomplished rugby player and skier. He won the annual Oxford-Cambridge slalom event in 1931 and was declared Britain's fastest in the downhill category. While skiing in Canada, he narrowly avoided being hit by his ski in his left eye, but the resulting stitches meant the left side of his face around his eye had a permanent droop and visible scarring. In 1932, Roger joined the 601 Squadron Auxiliary Air Force. He was commissioned in August 1932, promoted to flying officer in February 1934, and then to flight lieutenant in July 1936. Roger was an avid aviator. However, this didn't stop him from pursuing his career in law at the same time. During the early stages of his legal career, many remarked on his shrewd approach to cases, particularly as a criminal defence lawyer. It wasn't long before he was appointed to military cases, first prosecuting RAF personnel for various offences, and then more often as a defence lawyer. After the outbreak of war, Roger was given command of 92 Squadron in October 1939. On May 23, 1940, while on a patrol over Calais as part of the Dunkirk evacuation, the 92 Squadron had their first engagement with German fighters. Roger was credited with damaging 2 German planes before his own Spitfire was shot down. After crash landing in German-controlled territory, he was captured and sent to the Oberursel camp for interrogation. Jimmy Buckley was in his mid-30s, had begun his military career with the Royal Navy in the mid-1920s, and had spent much of his early career attached to the RAF. He had received several promotions from the Royal Navy and was made Lieutenant Commander on December 1, 1936. Following the outbreak of war, in January 1940 he assumed command of the No. 825 Squadron Fleet Air Arm, which operated from the aircraft carrier HMS Glorious. On May 29, 1940, Buckley was shot down during a bombing raid on Calais and was captured by German forces that same day. Both Roger Bushell and Jimmy Buckley were sent to the Stalag Luft camp near Oberursel and interred together. Oberursel was a small town situated 300 metres north of the main road that connected Frankfurt and Bad Homburg. Previously the site of an old government poultry farm, the Stalag Luft camp was opened in December 1939 to house a small number of captured British and French prisoners, including first senior British officer, Wing Commander Harry Day. Harry Day was the senior British officer at Oberursel camp, and due to his seniority of rank, by May 1940 he had taken on a permanent staff of POWs, whose job was to help newly captured POWs adjust to the prison camp life. It was at Oberursel camp where Harry Day met and befriended the newly captured Roger Bushell and Jimmy Buckley. Still eager to serve their country and play their part in the war effort, and with no way of knowing how long the war may drag on for, it wasn't long before Harry Day, Roger Bushell and Jimmy Buckley began formulating plans for an escape. Early on in the war, none of the POWs knew too much about how to stage a successful escape, but fortunately the German guards were equally unprepared in how to prevent one. Those Kriegis, short for Kriegsgefangenen, German for prisoner of war, who were brave enough to try, would devise their own private schemes, and so several escape attempts often happened in a short space of time. Although these were sometimes successful and led to the Kriegis making it past the barbed wire fences to freedom, they rarely had the resources necessary to elude the German guards for more than a few days. Knowing that a coordinated effort between prisoners was essential for any escape attempt to stand a chance of success, Harry Day formed an official escape committee within the prison camp, a team of prisoners who would devise, plan and execute escape attempts. He placed Jimmy Buckley in charge of escape operations, with Roger Bushell as Buckley's deputy. This laid the foundation for the series of daring escapes to come, and the 3 men wasted no time getting started. While at Stalag Luft near Oberursel, the escape committee oversaw the digging and construction of 3 secret tunnels that were to lead willing POWs under the camp's fences and into the German countryside. Once outside of the camp, the Kriegies planned to stow away on freight trains and then attempt to cross the border into neighbouring Switzerland or France. The tunnels consisted of a 6-foot deep shaft that began at a concealed entrance within the confines of the prison camp. A team of diggers then dug the tunnels out toward the camp fences, regularly bracing the sandy soil with wooden boards to prevent their collapse. The wooden boards were fashioned out of bed slats from prisoners' bunks or liberated from the construction projects that the Germans were undertaking to expand the camp. The first and second tunnels that were dug suffered from flooding and the team was forced to abandon them. However, the third tunnel was successfully completed in the spring of 1941. This third tunnel was dug under the bed of Harry Day in the Western Barracks block and ran underneath a sentry tower on the southwest corner of the camp. Although the exact date is uncertain, the willing POWs are believed to have made their escape attempt on the Whitsun weekend, which would have been June 1st, 1941. 17 British officers, mainly captured RAF airmen, escaped via the tunnel. Roger Bushell, who had opted not to use the escape tunnel, instead escaped from a goat shed on the camp grounds earlier that same night. Bushell was reported to have wanted to set off earlier than the others, as he intended to catch an earlier train as part of his plan. Unfortunately for the would-be escapees, all were recaptured within a week. Roger Bushell was captured on the Swiss border by a German border guard, less than 300 metres from freedom. Harry Day had disguised himself as a civilian and had planned to walk alone through the Moselle Valley and into neighbouring France, but was recaptured 5 days after escaping. Jimmy Buckley was caught aboard a train heading toward the Baltic. The 3 men and all other escapees were captured and sent back to Oberursel camp, where they served out a period of solitary confinement as punishment. It was reported that the German camp commandant, Major Rumpel, was so impressed with the group's attempt that he gave Harry Day and the escapees a case of champagne with a note that read, "Better luck next time, even if I'm not supposed to say so." A month later, in July 1941, Harry Day, Jimmy Buckley and Roger Bushell were transferred to Stalag Luft I camp along with the other escapees. Stalag Luft I was a newly built prison camp near Bath in Germany's north, built to house British prisoners of war. Roger Bushell was only at the new camp for a short time and was transferred west to Offlag 10C prison camp near the northwestern German town of Lübeck. Harry Day and Jimmy Buckley remained at Stalag Luft I, and again, Harry Day took up the role of most senior British officer. Once again, Harry Day set up a secret escape committee and appointed Jimmy Buckley as the leader. The 2 men made another escape attempt from Stalag Luft I in August 1941 after planning for 12 officers to use an escape tunnel under the camp fences. However, as the third escapee entered the tunnel, it was discovered by the German guards. All 3 escapees were quickly recaptured, and Harry Day and Jimmy Buckley remained at the camp over the winter before it was closed in March 1942. Day, Buckley and all the other RAF inmates were transferred to the newly built Stalag Luft III POW camp, arriving in April 1942. Meanwhile, Roger Bushell, along with all remaining British and Commonwealth officers of Offlag 10C camp, were to be transferred to another camp, Offlag 6B, by train on October 8, 1941. With the war now raging and with Germany building new camps to house the increasing number of POWs, it was not uncommon for prisoners to be shuffled between camps frequently. The new camp, Offlag 6B, was designated for captured officers and was located 1 kilometre outside the town of Dorsal, now part of Warburg, in northwest Germany. Roger Bushell was determined to escape again and was on the lookout for his opportunity. On October 8th, the prisoners to be transferred boarded the train that would take them south to Offlag 6B. Sensing his chance, Roger Bushell and a Czech pilot officer, Jaroslav Zafuk, jumped from the train as it stopped briefly in Hanover. Unnoticed at the time by the German guards that the 2 had made the jump, Bushell and Zafuk travelled to Prague in German-occupied Czechoslovakia, where Zafuk used his contacts for them to rendezvous with the Czech underground movement. The 2 of them managed to remain undetected for 7 months, laying low in safe houses while they worked to secure their escape. However, their attempted escape from Prague happened to coincide with the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich in May 1942. Reinhard Heydrich was the head of the combined security forces of Nazi Germany, and after the pivotal role he had played in Adolf Hitler's rise to leadership, Heydrich had become one of the most powerful figures in the Nazi Party, as well as one of the senior architects of the Holocaust. While in Prague, he was badly wounded by a bomb that had been planted by Czech and Slovak agents sent by Czechoslovakia's government in exile to assassinate him. Heydrich died of his wounds a week later. In response to the assassination, the Germans flattened 2 Czech villages and killed all but a handful of the inhabitants in an act of revenge. They also launched a massive manhunt for the assassins, and both Roger Bushell and Jaroslav Zafuk were inadvertently captured. After months of brutal interrogations at the hands of the Nazis' Gestapo, Germany's notoriously brutal secret police, Jaroslav Zafuk was sent to Oflag Kolditz, while Roger Bushell was eventually transferred to a new camp, Stalag Luft III, arriving in October of 1942. Here, Roger was once again reunited with his former Kriegies, Harry Day and Jimmy Buckley. Stalag Luft III camp was a German POW camp located near the then German town of Sagan, 130 miles southeast of Berlin. Having arrived in April earlier that year, Harry Day and Jimmy Buckley had both kept themselves busy, planning numerous escape attempts. Once again, Day had made Buckley the head of the escape committee, which became known as X organisation among the Kriegi population. Buckley was given the nickname Big X and oversaw several escape attempts during those 7 months, including a brazen and daring daylight escape, where 2 prisoners cut through the camp's wire fence right under the noses of the sentry guards. Amazingly, the attempt was initially successful, since Buckley had organised diversions to distract the guards. Other prisoners staged fights to draw the attention of the Germans, while the men managed to cut through the fences and make a run for it. Unfortunately, they were captured within a few days. Although the 3 senior members of the escape committee were together again, the reunion was brief. Stalag Luft III camp was becoming overcrowded, and during that month of October, the Germans transferred a number of officers to another camp, Oflag 21B, in northern Poland. Among those transferred were Harry Day and Jimmy Buckley, leaving Roger Bushell to stay at Stalag Luft III. Since he was now reaching a level of notoriety for his courage and ability to formulate escape plans, Roger assumed control of planning for future escapes from Jimmy Buckley and was soon dubbed the Big X of the escape committee. Both Harry Day and Jimmy Buckley arrived in Oflag 21B camp in late 1942. The camp was previously a boys' school in the town of Schubin, before the Nazis captured the town and erected barbed wire fences and additional concrete huts to house prisoners. Oflag 21B had recently been used to hold French POWs, and the facilities were poor, dirty, and freezing cold, with the Polish winter fast approaching. The arrival of Harry Day had an almost immediate effect on the POWs, and with his leadership, morale quickly rose. Naturally, both Day and Buckley began escape plans almost immediately, again with Buckley as the head of the committee. The escape plans were fast-tracked after Harry Day had a disagreement with the German camp commandant over the poor conditions of Oflag 21B. Harry vowed to devise an escape attempt as soon as possible. He intended to embarrass the commandant with a mass escape involving 34 men, which would be grounds for the commandant's removal by his German superiors. Harry Day and Jimmy Buckley oversaw the digging of several escape tunnels, and the first tunnel, which began under the camp's toilet block, was completed in March 1943. For this first attempt, Jimmy Buckley was given a place among the would-be escapees, while Harry Day would remain behind and make his attempt at a later date. On the night of March 5th, 1943, Jimmy Buckley, along with 34 other POWs, made their way through the tunnel, which ran a length of 150 feet under the camp and out beyond the prison fences. Among the POWs were future British Member of Parliament Aidan Crawley, author and journalist Robert Key, a German-Jewish RAF pilot named Peter Stevens, whose birth name was George Franz Hein, and future British MP Anthony Barber, who would go on to serve as Chancellor of the Exchequer in Britain from 1970 to 1974. All 34 men successfully navigated the tunnel and managed to escape into the Polish countryside, but 32 of them were recaptured within days and sent back to the camp. The two who remained on the run were Jimmy Buckley and a young Danish officer named Jørgen Thalbitzer. Buckley and Thalbitzer had planned to make their way first to Denmark and then attempt to cross the Øresund Strait by canoe to reach neutral Sweden. The two of them reached Copenhagen in Denmark and began the crossing by canoe. However, they did not make it, and Jørgen Thalbitzer's body was found washed ashore sometime later. Jimmy Buckley's body was never found. Later in that same month of March, Harry Day, along with other former escapees that included Aidan Crawley, Peter Stevens, and another Craigie, William Ash, who would go on to carve out a name for himself as one of the most prolific escape artists of World War II, attempted another escape. The group managed to escape through the latrine tunnel, which was accessed through one of the toilets in the block, with a tunnel entrance set in one of the sidewalls above the pool of raw sewage below. William Ash and Peter Stevens, aka George Franz Hein, were paired together and made their way to Stevens' mother's home, where they intended to get civilian clothes, food and money. However, when they arrived, they found that Stevens' mother had committed suicide shortly before the outbreak of war. Both men were recaptured shortly after and sent back to Offlag 21B. Harry Day had headed northeast after he escaped through the tunnel, on his own once again. He had intended to make his way to the coast and attempt to board a ship to Sweden, but was recaptured and also sent back to Offlag 21B, where he endured several weeks of solitary confinement in the cooler as punishment. The cooler was a small, dark cell, and in most prison camps, they were so small that a man could not fully stand or fully stretch out when lying down. Harry Day was released back into the camp, and not long after was transferred to Stalag Luft III to be reunited with the Big X, Roger Bushell. At Stalag Luft camp near Sagan, Roger Bushell was busy preparing yet more escape attempts. Bushell was being housed in the North Compound with other British airmen, and he and the other Kriegies channeled their energy into gathering intelligence on the routines of their German captors. As head of the escape committee, Roger was constantly assessing where the German vulnerabilities were that could be exploited, and on the lookout for opportunities that could be taken. Following his earlier recapture in Prague, Bushell had been interrogated by the Gestapo harshly, and as a result he had developed an intense hatred of the Nazis. The harsh treatment had emboldened him to make life as difficult as possible for the camp guards and to strike back against the Germans wherever possible, which included organising mass breakouts from the camp. He had also been inspired by Jimmy Buckley's previous escape and the disarray that it had caused the Germans. The German authorities, anxious to save face, had committed German combat troops to the search for Jimmy Buckley and his counterparts, troops that could have otherwise been deployed to the front. This proved to Bushell just how destructive the escape campaigns could be to the Nazis, and in early 1943, as the bitter Polish winter turned to spring, Roger devised what was to be the most sophisticated and daring escape attempted to date. One night, Roger called a meeting of the escape committee and delivered an impassioned speech to his fellow Kriegies. "Everyone here is living on borrowed time. By rights, we should all be dead. The only reason that God allowed us this extra ration of life is so we can make life hell for the Hun. In North Compound, we are concentrating our efforts on completing and escaping through one master tunnel. No private enterprise tunnels allowed. 3 bloody deep, bloody long tunnels will be dug. Tom, Dick and Harry. One will succeed." This impassioned speech that he drew on his skills as a defence lawyer to make impressed the other members of the escape committee so much that they put all of their efforts into construction of the 3 tunnels. Among the team were George Harsh, Wally Floody and Peter Fanshawe. Together, George, Wally and Peter formed the camp's triumvirate, which in Roman times referred to a group of 3 important officials jointly responsible for a crucial task. And nothing was more crucial than the construction of the escape tunnels. George Harsh was the head of tunnel security. Now in his 30s, he was Milwaukee-born but raised in Atlanta. George had a softly spoken southern accent and was prematurely white-haired and moustached. His fellow POWs described him as a friendly uncle-type figure or softly-spoken Kentucky colonel. As the official head of the tunnel security, George and his network of spies had the crucial job of ensuring that they knew the whereabouts and actions of German guards within the camp. George's story was unique, to put it mildly. Born into a wealthy family, while at university, he and his friends had decided to commit a series of robberies in the Atlanta area, not out of necessity, but just to prove they could do it and get away with it. So on a cold Atlanta night, pouring with rain, George found himself in a grocery store, revolver in hand, demanding the store clerk hand over the cash. Out of nowhere, another store clerk bobbed up from behind a counter about 20 feet away and fired the black revolver he was holding at George. George felt a hot pain in his groin and instinctively fired back, then watched the clerk, only a boy himself, slump forward as he was hit. He turned back and saw the first clerk also slump forward and hit the floor, shot in the back by his colleague by accident. Clutching his stomach, George made it to the getaway car parked outside that was being driven by his friend Frank, and the two of them sped off. They arrived at Frank's house, where Frank hid the gun while George wriggled out of his bloody trousers and jacket. The wound wasn't that bad, nothing that couldn't be disinfected, bandaged, and cured by lying low for a few weeks. But what they hadn't counted on was an unsuspecting maid innocently sending George's bloody clothes to the cleaners, which in the panic they had forgotten all about. Upon finding a bullet hole in the trousers, the cleaners called the police, who examined the trousers and found George's name tag sewn inside. It wasn't long before George was arrested and tried for murder. Despite the ensemble of legal talent hired by his family, it took a jury just 15 minutes to find George guilty, and he was sentenced to death. After a lengthy appeal, the sentence was reduced to life in prison. 12 years later, George found himself working in a prison infirmary, first as an orderly, and later as more of an assistant to the prison's physician, Dr. MacDonald, who had trusted Harsh and recognised his intelligence. During the fall of 1940, when a storm knocked out power and road access to the prison, George found himself and another orderly tending to an inmate with acute appendicitis. With no way of contacting Dr. MacDonald, George knew that in only a few hours the inmate would be dead unless he was operated on. George used his informal medical training that he'd received from Dr. MacDonald and successfully operated, removed the appendix, and stitched up the stricken inmate, who they had anaesthetised using ether. The inmate made a full recovery, and shortly afterward George Harsh was given a full pardon by the Atlanta governor, largely due to the glowing commendation letter that Dr. MacDonald had written, along with his exemplary behaviour record over the 12 years he had been incarcerated. By late 1940, George was a free man and was determined to commit himself to a worthwhile cause with the second chance at life he'd been given. He travelled north to Canada and signed up for service as an aerial gunner at the RAF recruitment office in Montreal. 3 days later, he forfeited his United States citizenship, was sworn into His Britannic Majesty's Armed Forces, and was sent to aerial gunnery school. At the end of the course, he discovered he was top of his class and found himself rapidly promoted up the ranks to pilot officer. In less than 2 years, George had flown and survived a full tour, 30 operational missions. On the night of October 1942, George Harsh stepped in as a replacement crew member for a mission over Dusseldorf. His bomber took off over the English Channel, waiting to rendezvous with the bomber stream. The bomber stream was made up of other Allied bombers that took off from airfields across Britain and would gather together to make one huge swarm on their way to the target. The only problem was that they didn't know where the bomber stream was. They were lost. As they flew over Cologne in France, German floodlights traced the bomber in the night sky, while German anti-aircraft guns released a hail of fire from the ground. They stood no chance, and as the damaged plane became engulfed in flames, George jumped and plunged towards the earth. After parachuting safely to the ground, albeit battered, bruised, and with several ribs broken, George Harsh was greeted by a German sergeant with the familiar phrase, "For you, the war is over." He was transferred first to Stalag Luft, where he was interrogated and routinely humiliated by the Germans, who forced him to remove his clothes and would make him march naked through the camp. This was a technique that the Germans used to break the spirits of Allied airmen, who had a reputation for being brave and brash. They figured parading an airman in nothing but his birthday suit for a few days was an effective way to break his spirit. After 2 days of interrogation, he was transferred out of Stalag Luft, and at the end of a long train journey, George Harsh found himself in the north compound of Stalag Luft III. As the head of security, George was in charge of a group of Kriegies who were the lookouts, nicknamed the Stooges. With the help of the Stooges, George would know every movement and action of every German in the camp, from the time he entered to the time he left. George had been quoted as saying to his men, "If a German sneezes, belches, farts, looks happy, bored or interested, I want to know why, when and where." George's team also ensured that the ground above the tunnel was clear. The Germans had a habit of driving heavy trucks around the camp in order to collapse any tunnels that Kriegies may have been digging in the ground below, and given the sandy soil, any tunnel engineer working would be crushed by the cave-in. Preventing this was obviously important, and no one agreed with this more than the chief tunnel engineer, Flight Lieutenant Wally Floody. Wally Floody was a Canadian and had worked as a miner on the richest gold mine in Canada before the war, so was perfectly suited to be the chief tunnel engineer. Wally was tall, 6'2", skinny but muscular, with dark hair. When war broke out, 21-year-old Wally filed an application to enlist in the Canadian Royal Air Force. In 1940, he was assigned to 401 Squadron, the number 1 squadron in the Canadian Air Force, and shortly after that he began training in their Spitfire aircraft on the English coast. On the morning of October 27, 1941, Wally and his 401 Squadron took off from the airfield at Biggin Hill, south of London. There were 2 other squadrons of Spitfires, 30 planes in total, making their way to the French town of St Omer. It wasn't long before they were spotted by the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, and Wally, having never been in combat before, found himself and his fellow pilots beset by more than 200 Luftwaffe fighters. Taking fire, his plane was enveloped by smoke and flames, and he bailed out, deployed his parachute, and crashed into the side of a farm cottage before ending up sprawled on the paved road between a group of houses. Wally looked up to see a group of German soldiers running towards him from about 200 metres away. As he watched them approach, an older French lady emerged from one of the cottages with a bottle in one hand and a glass in the other. She walked calmly over to where Wally was sprawled, placed the glass in his hand, and filled it with cognac. After Wally gulped it down, she refilled the glass for him and he drank that as well, as the German soldiers arrived. The German soldiers shouted at the old lady, who turned to them and shouted back fiercely, at which time she gently took the glass from Wally and calmly walked back to her cottage. Wally, like his counterparts, had been transferred first to Stalag Luft and then to Stalag Luft III camp near Sagan. It wasn't long before he became closely acquainted with Roger Bushell, who promoted him to the chief tunnel engineer within the escape committee. Working closely with Wally Floody was Royal Navy Air Arm Lieutenant Commander Peter Fanshawe. Peter was an upper-class Englishman with an accent to match. In 1925, Peter had joined the Dartmouth Naval Academy at the age of 13 and later joined the RAF. His upper-class accent and approach couldn't be more different to the raucous and often crude RAF airmen, and he was given the affectionate nickname Hornblower, named after the fictitious prim and proper British naval officer Horatio Hornblower. By the start of the war, Peter Fanshawe was in his late 20s and was assigned as the navigator aboard a Skua dive bomber that flew from the British aircraft carrier the Ark Royal. On June 13, 1940, 15 Skua dive bombers were launched from the Ark Royal and attacked the German battleship Scharnhorst while it was moored at Trondheim in Norway. German fighters intercepted the Skua dive bombers and shot 8 of them down, including Peter Fanshawe's plane. The pilot, John Casson, was forced to make an emergency landing on the Norwegian fjord. Both Casson and Fanshawe were captured, and Peter Fanshawe was eventually transferred to Stalag Luft III. Almost as soon as he arrived, Peter became involved in the escape efforts. He was pragmatic and thorough, able to solve problems quickly and efficiently, ideal skills for covertly constructing tunnels. His chief responsibility was to dispose of the sand that was being dug out of the 3 deep tunnels, 30 feet below. This was not a straightforward problem. The sand was a striking yellow that was easily identified and had a strong smell. Peter and his team, known as the Penguins, would collect the sand and transport it in sacks that were concealed down each trouser leg. Once out in the yard, they would release it using drawstrings in their pockets, and a group of Kriegies trailing behind would mix the sand into the soil by shuffling through it with their boots. They would also store sand wherever else they could find, like the camp's garden plots or the roof and wall cavities within their camp quarters. So it was that around April 1943, George Harsh, Wally Floody and Peter Fanshawe, overseen by the Big X Roger Bushell and with the help of fellow POWs, began work on digging Tom, Dick and Harry. Digging 3 tunnels simultaneously was a good strategy for 2 reasons. Firstly, if the Germans happened to discover one of the tunnels, they were unlikely to believe that 2 other tunnels at the same stage of progress were also being dug. The second reason was that if one of the tunnels flooded, like had occurred at the Oberusel camp in 1941, or had to be abandoned for any other reason, the team could then concentrate their efforts on progressing with the remaining tunnels. At 30 feet, the tunnels were much deeper than tunnels that had previously been dug, which were usually no more than 4 feet down. These shallow tunnels were often discovered, usually because any cave-in would be immediately obvious at the surface. But this time, it would be different. The German guards would regularly patrol and inspect for tunnel entrances, so the escape committee chose the locations of the entrances carefully. The start of Tom began under the floorboards of a hallway in Hut 123 in a darkened corner. The entrance to Dick was concealed in a drainage sump in the floor of the washroom in Hut 122, and Harry was hidden beneath a concrete slab under the heating stove in Hut 104. The entrance for each tunnel was decided by a group of 3 Polish POWs who had been engineers before the war, and the engineers chose each site using 2 criteria. First, that it was in a place that would be considered impossible to build a tunnel, like under a concrete slab. Second, that the surrounding foundations were sturdy and sunk deep into the ground, like a drainage sump under the washroom. Smashing through the concrete slab beneath the stove in Hut 104 to begin construction of Harry was a noisy business. The sounds were masked by the Kriegie Choir, which had been formed and now led by Major Johnny Dodge. At age 50, Johnny Dodge was not a typical POW. He was an American Army major who came from money, related to the wealthy Dodge copper mining family. He also happened to be related to British Prime Minister Winston Churchill through Churchill's American ancestors, a fact that would serve him well later on. The Dodger and his choir were regularly called upon to loudly perform Christmas carols, whatever the time of year, much to the fascination of the German guards. There were no auditions necessary, and it is safe to say that loudness was more important than singing ability. After smashing through the existing concrete base, a replacement concrete base was made using a timber frame and was designed so that the entire base would move, along with the stove on top. The Kriegies also fashioned a new stovepipe that would bend as the stove was moved to allow the diggers to enter and exit. It also allowed for the stove to always be lit, which helped to limit any inkling that a tunnel was being dug below. With the tunnel construction now well underway, Roger Bushell insisted that now that the plan was known to the POWs, no one should ever use the word tunnel in case the Germans heard it. From then on, the Kriegies always had to refer to the tunnels as Tom, Dick and Harry. Under each of the concealed entrances, 3 teams of 17 diggers would take it in shifts to dig a vertical shaft 30 feet deep. Both Tom and Dick were to be dug under the west side of Stalag Luft III's fence, an approximate distance of almost 300 feet. Harry, on the other hand, was even longer and was to be dug under the compound, under the solitary confinement block, under the camp perimeter road and a guard tower, and emerge in the woods beyond the fence. It was to be the longest tunnel ever attempted, but Roger had good reason to give it the green light. Hut 104 would be the last place the Germans would expect the prisoners to dig a tunnel from, given its location within the camp and the distance from the fence line. Roger was trying to outthink the German guards, and from early on he had a feeling that Harry was their best bet. The construction of the tunnels themselves required Roger and his counterparts to overcome the first basic problem. The sandy soil the prison was built on was easy to dig, but tunnels would collapse almost as fast as they could be dug. To overcome this, the diggers braced them with wooden boards that they had removed from their bunks. Fortunately, the Germans were constantly building new structures to enlarge the camp in order to house additional men, so there was no shortage of timber construction materials that the Kriegies could steal when guards were not looking. Teams of POWs were always selected to assist with the building work, and these teams managed to liberate timber planks that were then smuggled back for the diggers. Still, tunnel collapses were a constant problem, and it was a regular occurrence for tunnel diggers to be buried beneath the sand. The diggers relied on the desperate efforts of their colleagues to dig and haul them out before they were suffocated or crushed. The second problem facing the escape committee was the lack of air. Previously, tunnels had been built no deeper than about 5 feet, but at 30 feet down, the lack of air was a major hurdle. It was first noted when the flame of the diggers' makeshift lamps kept going out shortly after they were lowered down the vertical shaft. The lamps were made from a cigarette tin filled with boiled margarine, strained and cooled, with a piece of pajama cord thread embedded as a wick. If the lack of oxygen couldn't sustain a flame, there was no way it would keep a human being alive. They eventually solved the air problem using powdered milk cans. The milk cans were abundant in the camp and easy to get hold of, and the escape committee worked out that by cutting both the top and the bottom out of the can, they could then be linked together to make a perfect conduit pipe. The joins between each can were sealed with tarred paper, and then the vent was buried under the sandy soil along the length of the tunnel. Homemade bellows were placed at the foot of the tunnel entrance and operated by a strong Kriegie to ventilate the tunnel at regular points below. Besides the 3 tunnels, Roger Bushell had learnt from previous escape attempts that once on the outside, most of the escapees had been ill-equipped to remain on the run for more than a few days. This time around, Roger had formulated an escape that would dwarf previous attempts and planned to smuggle no less than 200 Allied prisoners through the tunnel. To ensure that the escapees had the best possible chance of successfully making it out of German-occupied territory, Roger Bushell drew on the skills of fellow prisoners and had them prepare forged identity papers, civilian clothes, food rations, and anything else they could get their hands on to improve the chances of survival. A key tool that was made for every escapee was a compass, and the man in charge of compass making in the camp was 27-year-old Sergeant Al Haig. Al Haig was a big Australian Spitfire pilot from Sydney who had joined the Royal Australian Air Force, or RAAF, after the war started. He had been shot down on April 4th, 1942 in a savage dogfight, parachuted down into France, and was quickly captured by the Germans. When he first arrived at Stalag Luft III, he had occupied himself by tending a vegetable patch, but turned his talents to making compasses to help the escape effort. With the demand for compasses for Roger Bushell's mass escape plan, Al set up a production line in his prison hut, which became known as the Compass Factory. The compasses were made in a 4-step process. First, used double-edged razor blades were magnetised by stroking them in one direction against a magnet that Al had liberated from one of the guards. The razor blades were then split into strips by wedging the blade in a hinge used as a makeshift vice, then expertly tapping the blade to split off a thin, magnetised needle. The second step was the case, which was made from gently heating and melting pieces of Bakelite phonograph record, and a small piece of card cut to shape was set in the new Bakelite case. Al then carefully painted the compass points on the card using a brush that he'd made from his own hair. Third, the magnetised razor blade strip was carefully balanced on the point of a phonograph needle that had been firmly embedded into the Bakelite case. Lastly, a small circle of glass was inserted over the top and secured with a drop of solder, which had been acquired from seals on cans of bully beef. With a pair of surgical scissors that he'd bought from a German guard, Al had shaped the glass from pieces of broken barracks windows. One of the more daring POWs, an American named Jerry Sage, had calmly liberated the camp commandant's alarm clock from his office. Al Haig chipped the luminous paint off the clock hands and glued tiny slivers of paint to the point of each compass to make them visible at night. Finally, he stamped the Bakelite case of each compass with the inscription, "Made in Stalag Luft III, patent pending." In total, Al Haig and his team made 500 compasses in preparation for the mass escape. Another prolific production line was that of Gilbert Tim Whalen's forgery team. In Germany at that time, anyone travelling anywhere needed to have appropriate papers proving who they were and where they were going. For an escapee to have any hope of success, he needed to have a convincing set of identity and travel documents. Tim Whalen and his team of forgers acquired what they needed through various means and improvised with what was available when they needed to. Toilet paper and thin pages from the Bible could be used as tracing paper. Pens, paper, inks and brushes were sometimes sent in care packages, carefully hidden, while some were liberated from within the camp. Rubber from boot soles could be carved into official-looking stamps. Other materials could be obtained from some German guards through judicious bribing. Kriegies would swap cigarettes, chocolate and canned goods that they had received in their packages sent regularly by the Red Cross. As the war tipped more in the Allies' favour, German helpers, often on reduced rations from the strain on Germany, were easier to find. In one instance, a secret anti-Nazi guard by the name of Gottfried Fischer would take stenciling and typing work assignments from Tim Whalen's team for his wife to complete at home. Another guard, an Austrian named Hauptmann Pieber, lent the POWs his Leica camera for the prisoners to take photos to send home to loved ones, which he developed for them. He never suspected that the prisoners instead used these photos for forged passports. Without a doubt, the most brazen scheme was when the escape committee paid the expenses of a German guard who was on leave to travel to Paris. Once there, the guard collected contact information from the French underground movement for escapees to use once they had reached Paris. All of this information and the raw materials collected were used to create forged documents for each of the escapees. The genuine documents were usually printed on paper with complex designs similar to a banknote, and each forged document took an expert forger a month to complete, working 5 hours a day. Tim Whalen and his forgery team worked tirelessly to prepare meticulously detailed documents for 200 Kriegies, complete with the expected stamps and signatures. The camp was made up of around 10,000 POWs, with 1,500 residing in North Compound, most of whom had decided not to participate in the actual escape themselves. However, over half of the prisoners eagerly accepted Roger Bushell's mission to gather provisions for the attempt. Survivors of the camp recall that helping prepare the escape effort became one of the most consuming elements of life for POWs at Stalag Luft III. The prison camp became the staging ground of a massive covert operation, with whispered coded conversations between prisoners taking place in dark corners and the gathering of supplies to be stored in secret caches, ready for the attempt. In the summer of 1943, while the digging went on, the Germans were becoming more and more suspicious that the POWs were up to something. At Stalag Luft III, Oberfeldwebel Hermann Glemnitz oversaw escape prevention with the help from squads of young Luftwaffe personnel, known as ferrets. Dressed in blue overalls, the ferrets were unarmed, instead carrying long, thin steel probing rods that they would drive into the ground, searching for tunnels. Part of the requirements was that they spoke excellent English, and so it was common for the ferrets to hide under floorboards or in attics, anywhere they could eavesdrop on unsuspecting POWs. They would also enter rooms without knocking, hoping to surprise the occupants while they were busy forging papers or storing maps, compasses, radios, or anything else that would give away an escape attempt. Oberfeldwebel Glemnitz was an engineer who had worked in Yorkshire, England before the war, and so spoke excellent English and also understood the British mentality. Glemnitz was a good-humoured man who had the respect of the inmates at Stalag Luft III, but now he and his team of ferrets were becoming anxious that a tunnel was being dug and an escape attempt was imminent. Glemnitz had a series of probes buried around the camp that were designed to pick up vibrations and alert the Germans that there was tunnelling going on. And the probes had been picking up plenty of vibrations. Although the POWs took their escape plan seriously, there was always a cheerful attitude among them. Glemnitz and the German staff did not have that luxury. The real power rested with the Gestapo, and neither the POWs nor the German prison staff wanted them to get involved. If an escape was successful, the Wehrmacht would need to be deployed, telegrams would need to be sent. Civilian police and Hitler Youth would have to be redirected in the search efforts. All of these were precious resources that Germany could not afford, and the Gestapo would make an example of the prison staff that they deemed responsible for the lapse in security. German officers could expect to be demoted or even sent to concentration camps, while those with lower ranks were dealt a more severe punishment, sent to the Eastern Front, and in all likelihood, a quick death at the hands of the Russians. Glemnitz and Camp Commandant von Lindiner knew there was a tunnel being constructed. They just didn't know where. Security began to tighten within the camp. Guards would suddenly burst into huts they were suspicious of, scattering the contents looking for clues. Snap roll calls would be called to try and catch out prisoners who were underground, digging. Without warning, the main gate would open and a platoon of German soldiers would stream in with automatic weapons and circle a hut that they suspected to be home to a tunnel entrance. They found nothing, but it reinforced to the POWs that security was paramount. As the tunnelling continued into the summer of 1943, an unexpected problem suddenly arose. The number of captured airmen was growing, and the Germans had begun the construction of the new South Compound, intended to house all of the American POWs, who up until this point had been mixed in with the other Allied nationalities. If they were moved from the North Compound before the tunnels were complete, the Americans who had toiled away at the escape preparations would not get the chance to escape alongside their comrades. The escape committee saw this as hugely unfair, and in response the decision was made to put Dick and Harry on hold and concentrate exclusively on Tom. If they could get Tom finished ahead of schedule, then the Americans could get their well-earned chance at escape too. All efforts were concentrated on digging Tom. Usually, the diggers managed about 5 to 10 feet per day, but with the new focus, they were digging double that. Within a few days, Tom went out another 50 feet. A few days after that, they were under the wire, with the tunnel now beyond the tree line outside of the camp. Perfect cover. As they discussed whether the exit shaft should be vertical or sloped, another setback. The German microphones that were buried around the outer perimeter of the camp were going crazy. One mic in particular picked up so much activity that it became clear to the Germans that a tunnel was being built practically right under the microphone. That gave them a clue, but still no clear indication of where the entrance could be, so instead they had begun cutting down the trees outside of the prison, precisely where the exit shaft for Tom was intended. Roger Bushell and Wally Floody calculated it would be another 10 days of digging needed to reach the new tree line. However, the Germans were now zeroing in on Hut 123, and Bushell decided to halt digging as a precaution, while the entrances to Tom, Dick and Harry were temporarily sealed. It turned out to be a timely decision when a crew of German troops suddenly streamed into the compound, surrounded Hut 123, and began digging a 5-foot deep trench that encircled the hut. Wally Floody had smiled, thinking to himself that the Germans had the right idea. They were just 25 feet too shallow. After the soldiers had left, digging at Tom restarted, and in just over a week, the tunnel had reached 285 feet and was beyond the new tree line. Then, disaster struck. A ferret, probably looking for a quiet corner to take a rest and smoke a cigarette, had stopped in the narrow corridor at the exact spot where the entrance to Tom lay. He had earlier picked up a small pickaxe that had been left behind by a German workman and was carrying it with him when he dropped it on the floor, sending a chip of concrete flying up. Knowing that older concrete did not chip so easily, he got down on his hands and knees for a closer inspection, and it took only moments for him to discover the entrance trap to Tom. For the Germans it was a triumph, and they marvelled at the engineering feat of such a vast tunnel, snapping pictures of the POW's handiwork. Visitors poured into Stalag Luft III to view the elaborate construction, which included senior Gestapo members. In the Gestapo members' minds, the security measures were clearly inadequate, and a new decree was made that all captured officers who had escaped would no longer be returned to their prison camp, but instead sent to concentration camps. Both the German prison staff and POWs knew that this would likely mean death, either slowly or with a bullet to the back of the neck. The escape committee was duly sullen by the loss of Tom, although their spirits were lifted when the tunnel was caved in by explosive charge. The explosion managed to shatter a drain pipe that serviced German staff quarters, and one of the watchtowers to tilt badly to one side. If they hadn't been successful escaping, at least they caused the Germans some inconvenience. Although the escape attempt had been thwarted this time, Commandant von Lindiner remained gravely concerned about the threat from the Gestapo to both the German staff and for any would-be escapers who fell into their hands. He wasn't the only one. The discovery of Tom meant that the Germans did not suspect there were more tunnels. However, Roger Bushell gave the order that digging would remain on hold until further notice. Roger was all too aware of the risk that the Gestapo posed. He had already been warned after his second failed escape attempt that the next time he met them would be the last. Still, he was determined to break out of Stalag Luft III. On January 10, 1944, Roger ordered the entrance to Harry be reopened. Chief Tunnel Engineer Wally Floody made his way down the ladder in the shaft and cautiously crawled into the tunnel. Before it was closed, Harry had been dug for a total of 150 feet, almost 50 metres, and although it had been well preserved with help from the cold winter hardening the ground above, there were some minor repairs in places where boards had failed and flooded the tunnel with sand. Harry was now the primary focus for the escape committee and underwent several modifications. A Canadian fighter pilot named Red Noble had been strolling back to his barracks one day when he noticed a roll of electrical cable leaning against a power pole while a German electrician worked above. There was no way the electrician would be able to get back to the ground in time to stop him, so Red picked up the roll and took off through 3 barracks, passing the roll through the hands of various Kriegies to be hidden. The electrician, who feared he would be blamed, never even reported it missing. The robbery meant that Harry was now lit up in a blaze of electricity thanks to the 800 feet of high-quality, insulated cable, deployed and then wired into the German mains. Wooden rail tracks had also been installed using materials liberated from the camp, along with wooden trolleys built from boards and with wooden wheels set on crude axles. The makeshift trolleys ran the length of Harry, which was broken up by 2 caverns dug out along the course of the tunnel that the Kriegies named Leicester Square and Piccadilly Circus. The 2 stops were larger than the tunnel, allowing diggers to store tools and materials as they dug. The miniature underground tube system meant that excavated sand could be placed on the trolleys, which were pulled back to the entrance by ropes, so the sand could be dispersed by Peter Fanshawe and his penguins. Wally Floody calculated that there was still 220 feet to go before they reached the tree line beyond the perimeter fence. The problem of where to put the excess sand was constantly an issue, even more so since the snow on the ground meant it could not just be scattered and needed to be hidden somewhere. Peter Fanshawe solved the problem when he suggested that the sand be dumped underneath the new theatre building that had been constructed in the camp. The theatre had been built to give the Kriegies something to do, and actually led to the formation of a Kriegie theatre company that put on twice-weekly performances. A secret trapdoor was built underneath seat number 13, and penguins would carry the sand in concealed bags beneath their winter coats across to the theatre before dumping it through the trapdoor. The tunnel gradually grew in length as the digging team toiled. One man would dig and push the sandy soil back behind it, where another man would load it onto a trolley. Once full, he would tug the rope, signalling for men at the bottom of the entrance shaft to haul the trolley back. The sand was loaded into German water jugs that had been stolen and hauled to the surface to be dispersed, while the trolley was loaded up with bedboards to brace the tunnel and milk cans to lengthen the air conduit. Another tug on the rope from their end, and the diggers hauled it back down the tunnel. In February, there was a close call. One morning, George Harsh looked out his window to see a group of Wehrmacht streaming through the main gate and surrounding Hut 104. George shouted to alert the others, "Ferrets! Ferrets!" then could only hope they had got the message. The Wehrmacht kicked open each door in Hut 104, turning the rooms upside down looking for any hints of escape activity. They found nothing, and later it became clear that it was George's warning that alerted the others to replace the concrete slab, move the hot stove back into place, and sweep any dirt into the cracks. They covered the entrance with only seconds to spare. On March 1st, the Germans announced a surprise roll call. They called the names of 20 POWs who were to step forward, wait for their possessions to be collected, and prepare to be transferred out of North Compound to new quarters. Among the names were George Harsh, Wally Floody, and Peter Fanshawe. The names were a selection of POWs that were suspected to be involved in escape activity. Surprisingly, Roger Bushell's name was not among them. Since the last escape attempt, Roger had made sure he was seen to be actively pursuing other interests within the camp, to give the Germans the impression that he had lost his appetite for escape. It had worked. However, they had lost a number of their most hard-working colleagues, who would no longer have the chance to make an escape through the tunnel they had worked tirelessly on. The escape committee knew the Germans were growing more suspicious than ever, and losing key members of the committee created a surge of determination among the remaining workers. Between March 3rd and 13th, just 10 days, the diggers built Harry out another 110 feet, the fastest pace ever. Roger Bushell and the committee calculated that they had reached the tree line, and it was time to dig out the vertical shaft to the surface. Digging a vertical shaft through sandy soil was an obvious problem. The sand above easily collapsed and had the potential to crush the diggers below. The problem was solved using a wooden shield that had 3 removable struts. The digger would hold the shield above his head against the roof of the shaft with one arm. Then with his free hand, he would remove one of the boards and dig out the sand in the revealed space. Then, the second board would be removed and the sand dug out of that section, at which point the diggers would swap and the next man would take over. On the last day of construction, the 19-foot high ladder made from bedboards was secured against the wooden braces that lined the exit shaft. 2 Kriegies, Johnny Bull and Harry Marshall, climbed to the top of the ladder and gently pushed a sharpened wire through the remaining soil above them. The soil was frozen but met little resistance, and they calculated there was just 9 inches of soil remaining between them and the surface. Realising that if a German sentry happened to step on the ground above, he would fall straight through and down the exit shaft below, the 2 men fashioned a wooden support frame. The frame was firmly affixed at the top of the tunnel and then packed tight with sand. The 2 men descended down the ladder and used a trolley to head back to the entrance, where they immediately told Roger Bushell that Harry was finished. Harry was a total of 336 feet long, with an entry shaft 28 feet deep and an exit shaft 20 feet high. A total of 600 POWs had helped in its construction, officer airmen who had been shot down during their missions over Europe. They were a mix from more than 10 different countries: Americans, British, Australians, New Zealanders, Polish, Czechs, Scandinavians, and South Africans, among others. Roger called a meeting between the most important members of the escape committee. "Harry is finished," he announced. "The final exit trap is in place and ready to be broken. The entrance is sealed until we decide the breakout night. Now, let's go over all of it again. It's no longer in theory. This is for real." The committee members, with a mixture of excitement and nervousness, discussed the plans for when to make a break. The next moonless night was 2 weeks away, beginning on Thursday, the 23rd of March. Saturday was the busiest in Germany for train travel, and the committee voted to make the break on the night of Friday the 24th to maximise the chance the escapees could board a train on the busy Saturday. Some of the committee members favoured waiting another month, since the Polish weather was still freezing. Many of the escapees, known as the hard-asses, would be making their way through mountains, and they would need to contend with 4 feet of snow if they left in March. The tunnellers, though, ended up having the final say. The tunnel was ready to go now, and in a month of warming weather, who knew if it would survive that long without a collapse? There was also the chance that the Germans would strike it lucky and discover Harry. It had happened before. There was a unanimous vote to go on Friday, March 24th. There was one proviso: the Big X, Roger Bushell, would give the final green light on Friday before 11:30 a.m. Only harsh weather or an unforeseen hurdle would stop the escape from going ahead. Over the next week, the escape committee went into overdrive, making sure that every man was prepared. 200 pounds of fudge, a hard glutinous crude energy bar made from sugar, oats, butter, and any other high-calorie resource they had found, was packed into 4-inch Coca tins and distributed to the escapees. Escape clothes were checked and rechecked, and each man received maps, identity papers, passes, and documents. On the Friday morning, March 24th, Roger Bushell and Harry Day trudged around the inside of the perimeter fence. Roger, usually tough, resolute, and sure of himself, was uncharacteristically nervous. Harry turned to him. "Forgery team is on standby, ready to stamp documents with March 24th. The escape committee has been called for 11:30 a.m. to hear what you decide. We can't postpone until tomorrow. No late trains run on Saturday. Roger's mind was swirling with information. The weather would be awful and probably get worse. 200 escapees on the loose would cause an almighty uproar. They would be hunted by police, home guards, Hitler Youth, the Wehrmacht, and of course, the Gestapo. 600 men who had slaved away for months had built the deepest, longest escape tunnel in history, and now they were waiting for his signal. Roger Bushell turned to Harry Day and grinned. "Let's get inside and pass the word. It's go." To be continued.